you've just joined us, hearty welcome. And because we're on the webinar format, we can't see each other. So please use the chat function to just maybe say hi and where you're from and what your interests are or what your focus of work is. It's always nice to get an idea of who we're speaking to. It's a nice way of being able to connect with each other and also have some conversations on the side. And just a few household rules for today is that if you have questions to Mark and any other of the respondents, we use the chat or the Q&A function for that. It's in the middle of your box of your screen, and there will be too much happening on the chat function for me to spot your questions there. So if you want questions answered by the speakers, please post them to the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. So just a warm welcome to our speakers. Our main speaker for today is Professor Mark Swilling from the Center for Complex Systems in Transitions. He's joined by Professor Edgar Peterson, based in Cape Town, and we're also just waiting for Professor Johan Scott from the Netherlands to join us a little bit later. It might be that he got mixed up with the time zones. He'll join us as he has time. Allow me to just quickly give a brief overview of who our speakers are. So Mark will be talking about his new book, The Age of Sustainability, that came out late last year. And Mark is Distinguished Professor of Sustainable Development at the School of Public Leadership, University of Stellenbosch, and co-director of the Center for Complex Systems in Transition. He has co-authored with Eve Anneke the book Just Transitions, Explorations of Sustainability in an Unfair World, and co-edited with Adriana Allen and Andreas Lampus the book called Untamed Urbanism, co-edited with Josephine Musango and Jeremy Wakeford. That book was called Greening the South African Economy and was the lead author in the Ivor Chipkin et al. Book on the shadow state and unveiling the politics of state capture in South Africa. He's a member of UNEP's International Resource Panel, acting as coordinator of the city's working group, and he's the deputy chair of the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa. He's also co-lead author of The Weight of Cities, which is a resource requirements report of future urbanism, and he's been visiting professor at the universities of Sheffield, Utrecht, and in 2018 he was the Edward P. Bass Visiting Environmental Scholar at Yale University. And just a sort of a brief introduction also to Professor Edgar Peterson that's joining us. Welcome, Professor Peterson. He's the director of the African Center for Cities, and where his research and teaching extends across theoretical and applied concerns. As an urbanist, he is deeply fascinated by the drama of cities everywhere and at different moments in time, including the future, the past, and science fiction's invocations. Simultaneously, he endeavors to remain grounded in the tough and messy realities of cities, invariably always on the move, working with materialist and aesthetic optics. His own work is rooted in two South African cities, Johannesburg and Cape Town, but he also tracks the fortunes of African cities as part of larger discourses on sustainable urban transitions and southern urbanism. His latest book, New Urban Worlds, co-authored with long-standing collaborator Abdul Malik Simone, is only the most recent of his prolific work. So if you Google African Center for Cities, you'll see his work listed there. His research agenda for the next 5 years is structured under the broad theme of adaptive urbanism with sub-themes spanning radical social economics, sustainable infrastructure, and more. And then a brief introduction to Professor Johan Schott, who will be joining us a little bit later. He's Professor of Comparative Global History and Sustainability Transitions at the Utrecht University Center for Global Challenges. He's Director of the Transformative Innovation Policy Consortium and the Deep Transitions Research Project. Hello, Professor Schott. I see you've just joined us. I'm just introducing you. A warm welcome from sunny Cape Town. He was Director of the Science Policy Research Unit, also known as SPRU, at the University of Sussex Business School in the UK from 2014 to 2018. And he is an academic entrepreneur that builds bridges between science and practice by applying transdisciplinary research approaches. He's working jointly with actors from different academic disciplines, policymakers, governments, civil society, NGOs, the media, and the business world to address the biggest challenges of our times, such as climate change and social inequality. So, warm welcome to all. I see we have almost all our participants signed on at the moment. Once again, please write where you're from, what your focus of work is, and by this, I hand over to Professor Mark Swilling. Mark, thank you very much for your time and for the wonderful and creative work that's went into this book. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Rika, and for coming in to host at short notice. Nina Callahan, our other colleague, had a family emergency to attend to, so thank you for that, and greetings to my colleagues, Edgar and Johan. Edgar and I have worked together almost our entire professional lives, so it's always great. We tend to pitch up at each other's book launches. So just a few words from me about this book. We are going to have monthly webinars on the different chapters. We'll start with chapter 9, the end of November, because that is really addressing the challenge of toxic masculinity, and we thought it's appropriate for the month of November. And then after that, we will revert to the order in the book. So this is really just an set of introductory comments to address 3 questions. So I have a very good friend who has written 7 books, and I asked her, what do you say at a book launch? And she said, there are 3 questions you must answer. Firstly, why this book? Secondly, why now? And thirdly, why me? So I want to try and answer those three questions. The book is really very much the product of the last 20 years of my active engagement with the world at 3 different levels. At the global level, especially via the International Resource Panel, where I've had the privilege of a kind of bird's eye view of the sustainability world. This was a panel set up in 2007 after the IPCC report on the 4th assessment report of the IPCC got the Nobel Prize. But that report didn't really address the challenge of how to transform the global economy from a sustainability perspective, which is what the IRP really does. So it's been amazing from day one to work together with an extraordinary group of people at the global level. Nationally, I've been involved with the DBSA board for 6 years now, and that's also been an extraordinary peephole into the dynamics of infrastructure investments, which are really at the very core of our challenges. And thirdly, for the last 20 years, I've been involved in the design and building and facilitation of the Lyndoch Eco Village, one of the first South African socially mixed intentional communities sustainably designed. And I think this engagement at these 3 different levels has really shaped my desire to write a book that is really telling the African story as if it is a global story, which is what I think we Africans need to learn to do. Traditionally, Americans are really good at that, telling the American story as if it's a global story. And I think we need to play the same game. And that's not least because the African story is actually, in reality, becoming more and more the global story, especially in light of the decolonial turn, which I'll say a little bit more about. I wanted to write a book that I've wanted for at least a decade. I've wanted to write this book, and I wanted to write it in a way that achieved the ambitions, a couple of ambitions. The first was really to make sense of a complex world in a way that rebalances, using influenced very heavily by Rika's work, rebalances ontology and epistemology. And what that really is fancy academic language for rebalancing how we understand the actual world and how we understand knowledge about the world. For too long, knowledge about the world has been dominant, and that has suppressed experience, and that has had unfortunate consequences for the way for the way we understand action in the world when we devalue experience. I wanted to make sense of the world also from the point of view related to that of rebalancing the inner and the outer, or the material and the spiritual. And it's not often that you can find academic space to talk about the spiritual. Thirdly, I wanted to really try and operationalize, not in an explicit theoretical way, but implicitly, what Rika and her colleagues call complex adaptive systems thinking, which is really at the center of our work together in the Center for Complex Systems in Transition. I didn't want to have complexity theory stuck on the outside of the building, as if, you know, when you step away from a building, you must see the building, not the tools. And then finally, I wanted to write a book that fused together what I saw was a kind of meeting point, a kind of crossroads between the post-humanist turn in Western philosophy and the philosophy of the relatedness in sub-Saharan Africa, associated with the word ukama, the Shona word for relatedness, which many of these sub-Saharan African writers refer to. And both the post-humanists and the sub-Saharan writers are coming together around the notion of the relational world, the relational self, the relational society. For the Western post-humanists, it's a turn, but for the sub-Saharan writers, this is relatedness has always been at the center of African thinking. So Ukama goes beyond Ubuntu. Ubuntu is relatedness between people, but Ukama is about relatedness of all things to nature, both animate and inanimate objects, but also via the ancestors to the past, present, and future. And I wanted to bring that together. I wanted to write a book also that proposed a theory of change that's fit for purpose. So I have always been very, and this is something Edgar and I have always shared, I've been very, very dissatisfied for years and years with the notion that the only change that matters is structural change. And if you think that the only change that matters is structural change, you're going to devalue incremental change. You're going to devalue small-scale change. And I really think that is inappropriate. Even during the struggle for democracy, I was one of those who really supported local level negotiations, because I felt that it wasn't just about waiting for the moment that you detonate the collapse of apartheid through some national uprising, but it was much more incrementalist. I also wanted a theory of change which was beyond just the state versus market dualism, that started to incorporate this new language of sharing, of the shared economy, or in particular the commons. And I think the commons stemming from Ostrom's work, Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, whose focus was more the natural resource as a commons. We now have all sorts of commons in the knowledge economy around the world, giving rise to all sorts of new ways of engaging, which I don't have time to go into, but I wanted that to become much more part of how we understand change. And then finally, I wanted to go beyond this very dissatisfying tension between futuring and experimentation. Futurists hate the present, and so they focus on the future and just want to get off. They see the present as this kind of burning platform between the past and the future. Experimenters are irritated with the chattering classes who sit behind flip charts and imagine the future but do nothing in the present. Can you bring these two together? Was a key question for me in exploring and elaborating this idea of radical incrementalism, influenced by the work of Roberto Unger, the Brazilian professor based at Harvard. I wanted to also identify not just the age of sustainability, which I demarcate as really beginning with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015. I also wanted to identify a dynamic of change, of a leading dynamic of change. And for me, this is the energy transition. And Johan and I have had some discussions about this, where he says it's not just energy, it's food and so on. I agree, but I think the energy transition has had the biggest impact. And really, I'm talking about the fact that, you know, we now, in terms of global investments in renewables, well over $300 billion, double total investment in fossil fuels and nuclear combined. Even the most optimistic graphs 10 years ago of what the uptake of renewables was going to be, with hindsight, we're actually very conservative. The uptake has been much, much faster. The disinvestment of the biggest financial institutions, the rapid drop in prices by 90%, even of batteries. It's an extraordinary transition which is underway. But what I was interested in is the origins, and the origins lie in Denmark and Germany, what are called the front runner countries. And it was actually cooperatives that really incubated the renewable energy technologies. And so, you know, to put it, to kind of elaborate that in story style, you know, imagine a bunch of hippies who protested against nuclear power and decided, well, you know, better demonstrate an alternative. But we set up a car, build a windmill, figure out how you do solar power. And those start attracting investments from citizens and local authorities and non-profit banks and so on. And a whole movement is constructed. By the year 2000, 80% of all windmills in Denmark were owned by co-ops. By the year 2012, 50% of all renewables in Germany were owned by cooperatives. And so what is forgotten when the energy transition is discussed, especially from a financial point of view, by economists like Mariana Mazzucato, is the community investment is ignored. And the problem with that is that the focus is decarbonization, corporate delivery, large-scale financial investments, and the social agenda is forgotten. And if we want a just transition, not just decarbonization, we are going to have to figure out ways in which we reclaim the social, reclaim the commons, recognize that the decentralized and distributed nature of renewables creates the material potential for a new kind of politics, a new kind of development, and potentially a more just transition. So that was, you know, chapter 8 really digs into that story. But I also wanted to face the reality that the age of sustainability is not just a nice, wonderful story, and it's great to be talking about this today. The age of sustainability has also triggered a reaction. So chapter 9 is really about the counter-reaction. And I, influenced by the work of Daggett and others, the people who write, who associated with the school of thought known as energy humanities, is I wanted, like many people who in the transition field, I was interested in why it is that climate denialists also tend to overlap with those who tend to reproduce toxic masculinity in their practice and in their cultural narratives, and there's quite a lot of literature around the world that is looking at the rise of authoritarian populism, the rise of populist leaders around the world, supported by conservative middle classes that feel themselves potentially losing out because of the transitions taking place, whether that's a sustainability transition or a gender transition or a more democratic transition, whatever it is. And the rise of those who are losing, backing those who promise certainty, is the greatest threat to democracy. But But those same narratives get overlapped and conflated with toxic masculinity. And I wanted to explore that. And I did the unusual thing. I explored it through my own context. I explored it through the South African context. So I have written extensively over the last couple of years about state capture, the political economy of state capture as a systemic process where a kleptomaniacal elite captures the center of power and then misuses those positions to repurpose state institutions for various nefarious purposes. But in parallel to that political economy literature that I was very much part of was another literature on the rise of toxic masculinity, and as a way of explaining the Zuma phenomenon. And I was particularly influenced by Matsilo Motse's book, The Kanga and the Kangaroo Court, which was about Zuma's rape trial. And that book, together with a whole bunch of writers, both men and women, who were trying to come to terms with the extraordinary rise of toxic masculinity in the South African context. And my question was, how did these come together? And at the very center of the Zuma project was an energy strategy, which was to build a Russian-built nuclear power plant. So here you have this kind of obsession with being part of Putin's global strategy for building Russia as a global nuclear power, conflated with a toxic masculinity narrative in a society where the majority are black, the minority are white. So yes, we are a very racist society. But unlike America, where the majority of white and the minority of black and racism is exerted against the minority, our authoritarian populism took a very different character, and in the end was defeated by a broad-based coalition to some extent. And so I was interested in understanding the resistance to renewables, the resistance to sustainability, the resistance to green, the denial of climate change in my own context, which is very, very different to many of the other contexts where the counter-reaction is analyzed. And then finally, I wanted to also bring the personal in and ask the question, what is the passion for change? And you know, for many in the sustainability world, especially what are often sometimes referred to as the greenies, you know, are depicted unfortunately in ways, you know, loving the trees, loving the flowers, loving nature. You know, it's all about love and coming together and building eco-villages. And I'm not sure that gets people off onto their feet and protesting against injustice and building alternatives. And I argue in the introduction to the book that what really matters is rage. Rage wakes people up. But I don't necessarily mean the kind of toxic rage that is associated with the masculine principle of control, hierarchy, and domination, but the kind of rage associated with the feminine principle of care. And I take the first line of the Iliad where the poet says, praise the rage of Achilles, goddess. It's talking to the goddess, talking to the feminine principle. And somehow maybe the kind of rage that aligns with the feminine principle is the passion for change that matters. So the question is, why now? Yes, we had the crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009 was the first year the global economy shrank since the Second World War, and this year is the second year that's happened. The adoption of the SDGs in 2015, our current crisis, which is different to the 2007, 2008, which was mainly a crisis of the financial system. Now we have a crisis of the economic system or the productive system. And I wanted a book that takes us beyond a state of what Manuel Castells calls a state of informed bewilderment, where we are buried below a mudslide of information on a daily basis, but we actually understand very little. And I wanted to, maybe it was too ambitious, but I wanted to, in a sense, map an understanding of the world that is rooted in an appreciation of long-wave theory, and Johan is one of the world leaders in long-wave thinking, which provides a framework for thinking about the patterns of history that could inform ways of thinking about the future. There's no certainty that history repeats itself, but it does influence our way of thinking about the future. And so I wanted to contextualize the economic and sustainability crisis in long-wave thinking in a theory of change that was respectful of incrementalism, as well as a theory of change that was informed by what is really familiar to Africans, going back to the writings of Fanon, of Steve Biko, of Chimamanda, of various others who have wanted to harness rage for humanist purposes. And then finally, why me? Why did I have to write this book? I'm not saying nobody else could have written it, but I had to write this book because of what I've experienced, that I've already mentioned at the global, at the national, and at the local level. At the global level, the work in the International Resource Panel has really been about documenting the end of the industrial era. Basically, if you take the extraordinary oeuvre of the International Resource Panel, that's we've looked at soils, we've looked at water, we've looked at all sorts of different metals, we've looked at wood, we've looked at all the different resources that global human civilization, as it is currently structured, depends on, that we extract from the crust of the earth and use, including water. And we've documented in very scientific terms that, hey, listen, we extract we extract about 70 billion tons of stuff per annum. There's no scientific evidence that if we continue to run the global economy as we do now, that we will have the resources to do it. So we have to change our relationship to resources and to nature. Yes, it's a bit anthropocentric for some in the language, but it is a way of talking to economists who unfortunately tend to be the people who decide how the world is run. Recently, I was admitted as a member of the Club of Rome, where the agenda is very much the global planetary emergency, and the focus is climate change. There isn't sufficient understanding there, I don't think. No, that's not right, actually. There are quite a few IRP members there who have been talking about resource for a long time. But the climate change is very much the dominant narrative. Nationally, within the DBSA, while I've been a member of the board, there's been a shift in the focus of the DBSA from an infrastructure bank to a bank that takes development seriously, which means a much more complex business, investing in institutional capacity at a grassroots level. And what has really struck me is how many of our problems in South Africa go back to the fact that we just don't know how to get our institutions right. And we don't have a problem with capital policy. We don't have a problem with kind of the structure of agency, but we do have a problem when it comes to institutions. And then finally, the Lyndoch Eco Village as a social experiment in building a socially mixed, ecologically designed community. That experience, above all else, is what has convinced me that we have to take incrementalism very, very seriously. I really do believe that, and one of the chapters, I think it's chapter 6, really provides about 27 different case studies of ecocultural movements and initiatives around in the global south, where reconnecting to nature and with each other is taken seriously. And that does have real transformative potential. So let me end off by saying that a lot of these ideas have been part of my own teaching program over the last 20 years at the Sustainability Institute, embedded at the center of the Lyndhoek Eco Village. And chapter 10 is a reflection on that. The title of chapter 10 is The Evolutionary Pedagogy of the Present. So it's place-based learning, it's respect for the present rather than impatience for the present. It's about interrogating the richness of the present and educating a generation of students in what it means to learn about sustainability in an African context, in transition, that both reflects the hopes and dreams of those of us who struggle for democracy and those who have come after, but at a local level. And therein lies a very direct and key lesson in what I'm trying to say, is that through this local context, so many people have transformed their ways of understanding and gone out and made a huge impact on the world. Thanks, Rika. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that succinct but wonderful overview of your book and the many interesting and new ideas that you're sort of weaving together to produce a new framework for us to be able to justify other kinds of doing and knowing from, to proceed from here. I invite Professor Johan Schott to give the first response or first remarks on your book. And Professor Schott, welcome and thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks for the invitation. I've been in the lucky circumstances that I've had an interview with Mark Schwilling before, which is published, 1-hour interview. So I'm very happy to engage again, precisely because this book is really a collection of arguments. Mark really brings together a number of strands, and I think that's highly unusual. The book has really a number of messages to offer. I was asked to comment from the perspective of transition studies. And let me say that so transition studies is a relatively young field. It emerged the end of the last century, and it emerged as a response to the environmental crisis, mainly at first, because it was clear that there was regulation in place, and people were trying to address individual issues, but there was no systemic view. So out of this conviction that to address, for example, climate change, but also the resource issue, we need a systemic view, came this new field, with the emphasis also on socio-technical. So the idea that change is not just technology, but it's also not just social or ecological. It's about the combination, the alignment between all of these elements. And in addition, there was the kind of realization that academic knowledge needs to contribute to problem solving in practice. So we need a transdisciplinary practice. And so this field emerged and has developed and has now become an academic field. And I think the book by Mark does two things in relation to the field. It reminds the field of some of its origins, because sometimes I feel that the field has become too academic too focused on, publishing the right papers instead of engaging with the problems at hand or the troubles of the world. And I think Mark's book is a forceful reminder of that. But secondly, he also stretches the agenda. So he brings new topics to the fore, and I would like to discuss these and perhaps in an open way, so they can also lead to a bit of discussion with the audience and perhaps with Mark. One is the issue of long-term continuities and discontinuities, because the transition field looks at individual systems and tends to look at a period of 50 years back. Well, Mark has a much longer perspective, and through this he's able to show that we live at a watershed moment in history, because he shows there are a number of ways of looking at the past, the social metabolic, the techno-economic transition, a social-technical transition, and long-term global development cycles. And you can see when you look at them that they all show these perspectives that we live at a tipping point currently. So the book is a reminder of this, and we have this window now of 10-15 years to respond to some of the really urgent problems. And so this is not a question, but I just want to say that this stretching and having this long-term historical perspective I really value. But you could debate that more, why that is important and whether we indeed live in a tipping point and how do we know. The second point is the Global South perspective, because the transition field is a Eurocentric field. It emerged in Europe. It's trying to stretch out. It's trying to integrate Global South perspectives. So it is doing that. But Mark has a clear definition of a Global South perspective. And I would like to highlight two aspects of that. One is to put the Global South, or as he says in this case, Africa, at the center. And I think this is crucial for the debate about the Sustainable Development Goals. Because how I see the Sustainable Development Goals is that they show that the developed world is as much a problem, or even more a problem, I would argue, than the developing world or the Global South. And the Global South may bring up many of the solutions that needs to be adopted in the Global North. But in any case, the lens, it's a Global South lens. So it's not about the fusion of Global North solutions to the Global South. It's not about appropriation of the Global South of Global North solution. It's about looking through this lens and then asking questions. So that's the first important contribution. The second is this focus on just transition, because we can discuss climate change, we can discuss the biodiversity crisis, but we need to tie it to the issue of inequality and a just transition. So without it, it doesn't make sense. And this is a clear message to the transition field, which even in its recent research agenda, just published, almost completely ignores the social issues. And Mark's book is a very important reminder of the importance of this. Well, the third topic I would like to address is this issue of the commons and the role of the state. The commons are often seen as a compensation mechanism, or as a temporary solution, or as an add-on to the state and the market. But Mark is willing to position the commons as a kind of core coordination mechanism for the economy and society. But does need a strong state, he argues. So both can go together, in fact. And I think this is an area that needs further thinking and further development. But I think it is an important idea and statement, because from my perspective, if we want to move to a new development trajectory, which I call the second deep transition after the Industrial Revolution, then we need a new governance model, and one in which the commons will have a core, or collective action have a core role to play. So this is an area for further discussion. The last thing is this notion of radical incrementalism, which is also very important, because what we see around the world is there are many experiments. So there are many alternative practices emerging, and you can ask the question, why would that be relevant? Because they are small, they are niche, they do not develop further. And I think that is an important observation. So we need to think about the transformative potential of these small-scale experimental practices. And the way we work with this in my practice, academic practice, is that we look at what we call transformative outcomes. So we look at how experiments can create a context which will allow more and other experiments and alternative practices to flourish. So we need to look at a collection of experiments. So we need to have a portfolio approach. We need to see them as mobilizing devices for generating a transformative context. That would be it. And I would like to hear from Mark what he thinks of that idea. But and I can elaborate that if necessary. But I think this notion of radical incrementalism, so that small steps really matter and can lead to radical change, is also a very important notion. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, and Professor Scott, for that, and for also putting your work in context, and for the links and the how to read this book also, and the ideas in that, based from the work that you've done and that you've sort of pioneered in this sort of transition theory space. And thank you for engaging also from that space, and for problematizing and highlighting the challenges and the sort of the bleeding edge in that space also from this perspective. I now invite Professor Peter Edgar Petersen, excuse me, I was reading your name and confused that. Please, we're looking forward to your response, and thank you for joining us today as well, Professor Petersen.
Thanks, Rika, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be here as always. And yeah, it's a bit overwhelming because, as Mark intimated in the beginning, we go back a long time, and you know, as academics, we've got very small worlds and small lives, and so we have these rituals when we bring things into the world, such as books, which are very important moments for us. So I'm really, yeah, it's a huge honor, Mark, to be able to share this with you. Now, I've been asked to kind of offer an African response. I'm going to interpret that rather liberally and say that my role today is that of the Imbongi. This is the praise singer, right? But of course, in the Xhosa tradition, the praise singer uses alluring metaphors. They make outrageous claims. They often use obscene language as a way of mesmerizing the audience and conveying the incredible presence and importance of the person they heap praise on. So I would love to do that, as all of you know that I am rather fond of obscene language, but I'll be a lot more disciplined than that, and I'll just invoke that spirit. But I will try and, I guess, translate a little bit. Mark gave a brilliant overview and summary of the book, and this is a tome. It's an enormous body of work, and so it is very difficult to distill a couple of ideas down to 10 minutes. The book is sweeping in its thematics, in the scales that it deals with, and also in the temporal range that it offers. And so to sort of help, I guess, distill and summarize some of the key characteristics of the book, I'll just very briefly try and name what some of these descriptors could be, if one has to try and give a sense of this incredibly accomplished and very, very profound body of work. So the first descriptor I would say is the book is fearless and brave. And for me, this is evident in the fact that Mark wrestles with a number of extremely weighty, but also some of them almost insoluble questions. And what is significant about this book, and for those who know Mark, you wouldn't be surprised, but for those who don't, is that in his quest for answers, he doggedly follows where the questions lead and the kind of dialogues that is needed, and then he steps in as the interlocutor, particularly between cutting-edge thinkers in Western theoretical tradition and a cohort of African theorists and philosophers. And this in itself is, of course, highly original, but it is a mesmerizing thought experiment. And, you know, just if for nothing else, to just sort of see the potentiality of that, I would highly recommend sort of engaging with the work. But in a second sense, the book is brave because Mark, from the outset in the introductory chapter, puts himself squarely into the frame. And he does this by exposing and critiquing the white masculinist assumptions that often live and thrive at the DNA level of modern Enlightenment social theory. And of course, by extension, his own socialization, which he brings into the book. And in the process, he inevitably makes himself profoundly vulnerable, both in terms of his own complicities, but also his blind spots. And to give you a sense of how this works in the book, I'll just quote, or sort of pull out this one quote, open quote. "If South Africans agreed to become a rainbow nation without addressing the real cause of black rage, and indeed women's rage, where does that rage go? And from this, what must a white male do when so little changes and so much rage is suppressed?" End quote. The second descriptor I would give is that the book is, and again, you know, for those familiar with Mark's work wouldn't be surprised, but it's incredibly fluently written. And as a result, it is really elegant and inviting. So, you know, sort of when you sort of immerse into the text, it feels like Mark has invited you onto his wraparound porch, overlooking the valley and the mountains, stiff whiskey in hand, and he's eager to lead you through a dense and imposing forest of ideas and facts. These are, of course, terrains that you'll never be brave enough to traverse on your own, but the point is that you might not even know in the first instance that the forest is there. But it is precisely in the clarity of the book that there's both an invitation to listen very carefully, but also an invitation to what I believe is to enter a life-altering journey, because some of the provocations and questions that are raised here will compel you to think very differently about yourself, your institutions, your professional life, your intellectual commitments and attachments. The third descriptor I would say is that the book is undoubtedly, and Johan has intimated this, it's ambitious. And saying it's ambitious is somewhat of an understatement. There's a number of really big conceptual moves here. And of course, Mark has given you a sense of what those are in his summary remarks at the outset. And I've certainly, I feel, not lived long enough with the book to really, really judge whether he pulls it off or not. But what I do know is that he has provided a brilliant map for debate and further research. And I'm absolutely certain that this is going to be a really generative resource for dozens and dozens of young, particularly African scholars who work across the environmental sciences, the social sciences, and the spatial disciplines. And I'm really looking forward in a way to what the legacy of this work will be, because it is so suggestive and it is so generative of really being brave and radical in the kinds of questions that students and scholars are allowed to ask themselves. And, you know, one example of this maybe is just to, for those who sort of work in the academic terrain, is that Mark opens up this conversation between feminist posthumanism with Rosa Brandiotti as one of the sort of key proponents or exponents of that, and African philosophy in the vein of the work of Murove. And he makes a case for this idea that he again referenced earlier of radical relationality. as both ontology and epistemology, and as a sensibility of beginning to work or inhabit a number of incommensurabilities if we look at these different transitions as, if you will, stacked or as interlaced. Now, just to give you some sense again of just how ambitious and magisterial in scope it is, on the one hand, he sort of walks the reader through how transdisciplinary research has enabled us to begin to understand how essential it is to engage with systems knowledge, with what is called target knowledge. And this is, as Mark explains, knowledge that is about very specific desired end states, this idea of what the futurists are engaged with. But then, as he again mentioned in his open remark, the third category, which is transformation knowledge. And this is the detail about change. How does it get into the world? And how does one get from, as he says, where we are now to where we need to be? Another sort of domain that he works with, and that is, of course, a really expansive and theoretically dense body of work, is complex adaptive systems theory. And within this, he opens up a conversation between some of the leading proponents of that set of theoretical debates, feminism, post-colonial studies, and political ecology, and finally, a sort of the work of actor network theorists like Bruno Latour. And all of this is really about fundamentally not just decentering, but displacing, and in some ways, I think, convincingly critiquing so much of what constitutes the mainstream within the academic world and within theoretical thought. And this is always done not just to have a more robust and effective deconstructive or analytical capacity, but about thinking through how things can be done differently. And sort of the bravery comes back in here, because in another part of the book, Marx says the following: this middle way, often referred to as post-capitalism, lies between market fundamentalism and statism, both the socialist and the social democratic varieties. So in other words, what Marx does here is that he's saying, he's sort of calling out both the mainstream tropes, but also the radical tropes that is often the binaries that we are forced to choose between. And within this, and I'll come back to this in the end, as Johannes also mentioned, he opens up this terrain of thought and engagement that a post-capitalist commons might just be what lives at the heart of this idea of radical incrementalism. Now, the possibilities this opens up for thinking differently, for appreciating existing practices in more substantive terms are indeed profound. But this is also a good segue to another characteristic, and that is that the book, for all of its theoretical innovation and attention and detail and creativity, it insists on remaining grounded. And again, Mark mentioned some of the concrete experiences, his own practice that infuses both his theoretical outlook, but also the questions that has driven the body of work forward. So for me, one of the most important contributions of the book is that it demonstrates how one can both renovate and innovate social theory through a form of activist, action, engaged research that arises from the intimate engagement, and this is the key word here, with mainstream society. And so even though it might sound as if this idea of micro-experiments as a form of radical incrementalism is something that is pristine and neat and if you will, uncontaminated by the real world. In fact, Marx makes the opposite argument, that unless we're willing to inhabit and engage directly with all that we critique, we're not really going to get to the insight and the understanding about what incremental transformation might be about. But this does leave one with very uncomfortable and destabilizing conclusions that neither statist or market-led approaches hold all the answers. But instead, there's something more uncertain, more dispersed, certainly more messy, and definitely incremental that is about the real world. But how to do that in a way that always keeps an eye on system change, but this can only be done through, if you will, an engagement with one's interiority. There's got to be a personal reflexivity and awareness and an openness to not just others, but to nature's inanimate objects, ancestors, spirits, and so forth. And so it is really, really powerful to then see how he explains the, if you will, mechanics of this through his own practice. And what I found as someone who was involved at a board level with the establishment of the Sustainability Institute, I found that part, the back end part, really, really instructive. And even half of that story I didn't know, even though I was relatively close to that process over the last 20 years. The final point I want to make as a descriptor of the book is that it is reassuring in a weird kind of way, because it reminds us that we don't have to see or understand the whole system, but rather we can place our faith or confidence in a certain way of reading the world and inhabiting it, but always alive to our biases and how we need to dialogically figure out what the next step might be. And that is what gives us the energy, if you will, to invest in the long haul, because institutional work is always, if you will, intergenerational, and it's painstaking, and it never comes with any kind of guarantee. And there's something deeply reassuring about knowing that even though the complexity and, if you will, the inequalities in the world can be overwhelming, that there can be ways of inhabiting it that can still animate a certain passion, a certain belief, if you will, not just in the future, but even more importantly, in the present. So having done my Imbongi work, let me just end off with two very quick quibbles or two quick questions or comments to Mark as we move into the Q&A phase of this discussion. One, Mark, you make an extended, and I would argue a persuasive case for politics of the commons, and that this is missing from a lot of the complex adaptive systems thinking and approaches, as well as African philosophy that remains often at the level of abstraction. However, in sitting with the work, and admittedly, as I've indicated, I feel that I haven't lived with it intimately enough to fully grasp everything. At the moment, I'm not too clear how your social model of the commons differs from assumptions of communitarianism, either in its Euro-American variants or in the African versions that stem from tenets of Ubuntu. And it would be really useful for me to just understand a little bit more of that. The second comment is that is I guess more of an uncertainty. And this is your discussion, and I think really critical and so vital about the importance of rage to fire up the kinds of solidarities and collective action that we need to create the ground for radical incrementalism. Now, you make the case that rage is needed to overcome ingrained, internalized, and you use the word docility. Now, like I tripped over this a couple of times, because in your notion of docility, it felt to me that it got very dangerously close to the Marxian idea of false consciousness, a version of understanding people as trapped by ideological apparatus. Now, going back to your meta-theory, or meta-theory 2.0, as you call it, I'm not too sure how you square that reading with Brandiotti's conception of the human. And I quote you here, where you say that she argues that the human is fundamentally constituted as a relational subject framed by embodiment, sexuality, affectivity, empathy, and desire. So, Mark, in conclusion, thank you for the gift of this book. I know it is one of those treasures that will always yield new insight and excitements whenever one returns to it. And I really, really hope that those who are on the webinar and your students and their students and so forth, that this book really is given as the gift of choice in the upcoming festive season. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Peterson, for your very eloquent impressionism of Imbongi. Yeah, it was really wonderful to listen to your provocations and ideas. And what I've realized is that who we have here in front of us today are also three pioneers. All three of you who have presented are pioneers in this sort of theoretical and practical space of sustainability science in some way. And Edgar, you've actually laid out beautifully what the current work is that is needed in this space. I think often for the new generation coming to this table, what we've seen is that students actually depart from this notion of sustainability or transitions or just societies, but they don't know what came before anymore. They didn't, do that work of the pioneers to find new theories, new ideas, new practices to actually push back on the sort of the old guard and the old ideas. And it was wonderful to hear also, the importance of what this book has done and how it's actually re-engaging not only with sort of the old theories and the old literature and the initial pushback, but also that it's a kind of a contribution to a new kind of dominance theory that have emerged out of this new space and have become dominant. And Mark's work is actually once again critiquing that. So and once again, challenging theorists and practitioners to relook and critically rethink the assumptions and the spaces where they are acting from, and then of course reigniting the importance of other ways of knowing and drawing from other ways of being in the African context. So thank you very much for all three panelists and presenters, insights and ideas and the provocations. I see that there's a few questions in our chat box, but before we open the floor, I would like to ask Mark if you would like to use the space to maybe first reply to Edgar's two questions, one on the notion that your idea of the commons could stand closely with the idea of sort of communitarianism, and then a reflection on rage and docility before we move over to the chat box and also give people some chance also to post some questions. And at this stage, I would just like to also mention that we all have many personal views when it comes to sustainability, transitions, and what is just and what not. But please, let's try and keep this discussion on the scholarly level and also to engage with the material as such and not just post our personal views. Thank you very much. Mark.
Yeah, sure. I'm so happy this is recorded. I can go back to these very rich comments from Johan and Edgar. And it is rare in the academic world when people are generous. And so, this generosity of spirit that exists amongst those of us, and I think you're right, Rika, all three of us have engaged the world and then interpreted, as well as interpreted the world and engaged it. And this circular, iterative way is, I think it constructs a certain kind of sensibility that I really appreciate. In layman's terms, it's the activist academic that I think really matters. I think the commons and communitarianism question is a great question, and it really is very surprising to me how the literature on the commons, which is quite well developed in the European context. If you look at the work of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation, Michelle Bowens, and many of those, there's more academic versions that is a bit more skeptical, but the more activist literature on the commons has had very little impact in the African context. So in a context which is profoundly relational in many ways, we haven't actually come up with appropriate institutional forms that is appropriate to that relationality. Participatory development is so pale and anemic in significance when it comes to relationality. It's basically irrelevant in my view. And we have these patrimonial states that are organized hierarchically. And where relationality exists, it's in the informal. And it's very powerful there. So I'm really talking about more the formalization of relational institutionality. And if you look at the work of Jacques Dwellers International in African context in particular, I think there is a good example where attempts have been made at formalization and institutionalization of a relational dynamic. But I think the fundamental difference is that for people in the commons literature, we are already, all of us, living relational lives as a result of the information technology revolution. We live in a peer-to-peer society. We use Airbnb, we use Uber, we use Facebook, we use Twitter, we are continuously associating and communicating through these platforms and what is now referred to as platform capitalism. And if you've seen the documentary, The Social Paradox, it's very, very clear that in every single time we click, we are contributing to the wealth of the most powerful corporations that have ever existed, according to that documentary. And so the commons literature is really about reclaiming the commons in a way that does not feed platform capitalism and creates a new institutional architecture that deploys the materiality that has been created by the ICT revolution in a way that is potentially much less extractive. In fact, for some, totally non-extractive, and which is why it's referred to as post-capitalism. And at that global level, there are the examples of Wikipedia, Mozilla Fox, Linux, Apache servers, and so on. And at the local level, there are tens of thousands of examples where architectures are being constructed that allow for knowledge, voluntary contributions to a shared knowledge commons, just like people protect a meadow or a forest in the natural environment, a la Ostrom, creating this kind of shared knowledge commons with a set of rules that allows the contributors to draw down the shared knowledge for their own social enterprises or purposes for living. And that creates the possibility for doing what has never been possible before. If you innovated a new idea before, it either disseminates across society via the market or via the bureaucracy, or a combination of both. ICT has created a new organizing mechanism for us as human beings, the network. And that network has become exploitable through the multiplicity of small data transfers that we then donate for free. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think that's what the commons literature is basically saying. We now have the technology to organize ourselves as if we are in a small group, but on a global scale. And that's never been possible before. And I think that's really, the operating system, the DNA of the new commons. So that's very different to communitarianism, which is severely limited by the local. It's dependent on face-to-face. We now have broken that spatial constraint in order to create economies rather than communities in the traditional sense. So, but that's a very limited. What I've just talked about. I don't find, it's not even in the cooperative movement where you would have found the literature on the commons and the cooperative movement have hardly connected. It's like amazing, but it's true. So on the question of rage, yeah, you've kind of shocked me and tripped me up. And yeah, I definitely, for me, it's definitely not about false consciousness. It's about it's about a form of socialization that gets internalized to reproduce subsequently to this book, I'm really, really regretful that I only read Ndlovu Gacheni's book on empire and decoloniality, where he makes the core point: you can have decolonization without decoloniality. So colonialism, the 500-year process of colonizing the world, constructs a form of colonial consciousness which doesn't go away when you have decolonization. And so he talks about the decolonial turn. And I never used that term. It's a fantastic term, and it's an important concept that challenges, in particular, Africans, to all of us, doesn't matter our lineages and backgrounds, to break out of what Fanon called the what is his beautiful phrase? Basically the desire to copy. He's got a phrase for it. I just can't remember it. But the desire to copy, rather than risk originality, rather than risk looking at our own context, we think that what's valid is what has worked elsewhere in another context, and we need to download it. So it's a continuation of docility, of cultural docility. So yeah, you're right. The relational view says we are embedded in context with all the affectations. Let's treasure that, not believe in things that make it go away.
Thanks, Mark. I think those, even just hearing those words, rage and docility, and bringing in some kind of, different understanding of action and agency, is also the enormous contribution that you bring into this discussion. It's opening it up to, so many different domains where people can also start to feel what this feels like to be engaged in this space, and move it just from the theoretical engagement or the policy-based engagement, but actually to the lived experience of people who are doing this work, or are being, or are sort of on the receiving end of developments in a sense. So I think that's a really interesting vehicle for using those words to open up those spaces. I would like to ask Johan, before we move on to questions, whether you have any response to also both Edgar and Mark's responses. If you would like to contribute something. I saw that you've typed something about some other themes and questions or resources also about the comments. Or
No, I think it's good to open up for the participants.
Great. Okay, then we'll move to the questions, and I think there are some wonderful questions coming up. Some questions that are challenging, sort of, I would say, perceived once again academic views and ideas, sort of from practical spaces. And I think the idea, Mark, maybe to just broadly engage, or maybe ask more generally, to sort of summarize also Don Cox's questions there about this notion of radical incrementalism. Have you, maybe to rephrase it also just in a broader sense, have you experienced any, or what are the kinds of critiques and pushbacks that you get when you speak about radical incrementalism in relation to kind of transition work?
Well, as Edgar says, it's really, it creates a discomfort zone because people at the moment, there's a high level of anxiety because of uncertainty. And the uncertainty is around knowing the old structures no longer work and they have to go. But the new structures have not been put in place. So there's nothing to trust. So we're in a kind of liminal space, a kind of limbo, and I think the idea of radical incrementalism feeds into that. So for some, it's a form of relief. My little project, my little attempts at making a small contribution actually matter? That's the one, I think, response. And my response to that is yes, it's conditional though. You have to join the dots, you have to connect. You can't just stay in your comfort zone. The second response is, yeah, all very well, but it basically means the people in power who reinforce the existing structures will be very, very happy that they're no longer challenged. And that's a misreading. My response to that is, for people to continuously challenge, they need to sustain themselves, and they sustain themselves by making small advances, small victories that demonstrate to others it's worth getting up and protesting. It's worth getting up and building an alternative community. It's worth saying, taking the risk on the board of a company. No, we can't continue to do business this way. So I think I try and hold a space of tension. And when you get rid of structure, people end up in having to really come to terms, both inner and outer, with the beauty of practice.
Thanks for that. Linking to that notion of tension, I think there's a question from Jeremy Joseph, who asks, how does one comprehend and reconcile the critical schism between a transitionary framework, or the work of sort of transitions thinking we've put in place with our systems, while at the same time climate breakdown is bringing us radically a transformative world. I think in short, he asks, how do we reconcile these radically transformative states of climate breakdown that's almost destroying the commons upon which we need to live and draw from, with the views in your book, and how do we act to avoid collapse while at the same time having to engage in different ways. So maybe
yeah. So especially in Europe, but you hardly find it ever in Africa, interestingly enough, but especially when I teach in Europe, you have what I call the doomists, the doom and gloomists, who are basically people who've given up. Basically, the argument is, no matter what you do, things are going to collapse. So bring it on, bring it on. Just like bring it on, let it happen, and we'll pick up the pieces, And it's been well developed by Zizek and so on. But and interestingly, you don't find that. It's not very common in the African context, where struggle and suffering is like a permanent condition for so many people. And like the crash is a permanent condition, if you like. A collapse, it was nothing, and it's just survival. If the logical conclusion of the notion that there's a schism between, things are collapsing anyway, so what's this got to do with transition, is do nothing. Whereas in my view, the threat of crisis, of collapse, of all of that should actually spur on and reinforce the commitment to transitions, to understanding like the global energy transition, for example, understanding it and seeing the force that it is. At the same time, it must reinforce incrementalism, and in particular, radical incrementalism. So that's just because things are going to collapse doesn't mean there won't be transitions. There will be.
And can I speak about the topic?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think the first thing to argue is that indeed we have to embrace uncertainty. So if you first want certainty, also about your own actions, that the era we are entering there will be a lot of structural uncertainties and collapse. What we know from history is also that it's important to be prepared. So if you have alternative practices in place, they can also be scaled up in times of collapse. If you have nothing in place, it will be very difficult. So if you look at the 20th century, you know, and the period in Europe after the First and Second World War, we had a bloody first part, of course, of the first part of the 20th century, but there was a history here of working on alternatives. You can see that in the work of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was seen as a failure because politically it could not stop, you know, fascism and war. It could not prevent war. But the League of Nations also worked on many other issues. It was experimenting with issues relevant for the development of the welfare state. And that work fed into the work done during the war for post-war reconstruction. And that work could flourish after the Second World War and taken up in the context of the UN. So also all the work on human rights, for example. So I think the long-term perspective here is important, that also Mark in his book brings. And we can only do so much. But it's not the case that small steps do not matter. You know, history shows they did matter in the past, and they will matter in the future. For me, a big question is how can we, let's say, anticipate and work on this transformative potential? How can we make sure that our small steps are as transformative as possible? And here I can see that the state can play a role by connecting by connecting many people who are working on all of these steps, because we need intermediation and we need mobilization. And the state could play a role here as the facilitator of this. And I think Mark would agree with that. Well, that would be my response to that question.
Thank you. Edgar, I just want to hear from you whether you have any responses to that.
Just to add a small wrinkle to the discussion. So I think that there's something about the emergent institutional forms that we don't understand very well. So I'm just going back to Mark's point about rage and about the sort of the grunt work of day-to-day prefigurative activity, right? Whether it's a highly specialized thing or at a neighborhood level or a household level or a specific thematic area. And I'm struck by the consistent echo at the moment around youth-led mobilizations in Lagos, Bangkok, Belarus, and so on. So this insistence, well, not Belarus in this case, but this insistence echoing the sort of original Wall Street protests, that it's a leaderless movement, right? That there's an eschewing of classic social movement forms of organization and mobilization in favor of something a lot more amorphous, decentralized, radically decentralized, and driven by a sort of affective sense of community, as opposed to a structured organizations and so on. I don't know what it means. I don't know how effective it is, but it is certainly noteworthy that from the Arab Spring across all of the sort of main protests in Latin America in the last couple of years and so forth, that there is a clear and unmistakable reconstitution of institutional formats emerging in expressing rage. And I don't think we have the language for it yet. We don't, you know, there isn't quite, but it is very much connected to the intermediating work that happens in the practice of radical incrementalism, where you kind of where you're deeply immersed in the transformative detail of a specific aspect of exclusion or environmental destruction or violence or whatever the case might be, and all of the care that takes to pay attention to psychic states, to institutional reconfiguration, to think about alternatives while doing ameliorative work and so forth. So all of that beautiful, careful, intricate weaving work that you have to do at quite an intimate scale. And then this insistence that, let's call it a refusal of the inherited modern institutions that is just not doing the work of providing jobs, of providing safety, of dealing with the social safety net, all of the stuff that is animating young people across the continent, and particularly in Lagos and other Nigerian cities over the last month. And so there's something to work with here, I think, but we need a lot more empirical work to begin to really piece together what this might mean theoretically, but also what are the kinds of institutional possibilities that can be enabled through digital intermediation, where communication is radically different. So just a few thoughts on that.
Thank you. What I get also from what you just said, Edgar, is that also this word rage, it seems that we have one common understanding of what that could mean, but what you've done is you've sort of opened up the possibility or the space for us to see different kinds of expressions of rage, that it's not just, the flag bearers or the Extinction Rebellions or the bigger things, but that it works in many different symbolic and mediated ways, in ways that are quite new and creative, and I like the way that you also sort of bring that back to the intimate lived experiences of every day.
So if I can just a quick follow on, if we kind of trace the biographies of the leaders of the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movement, it's fascinating, right, to see the kind of institutional positions that they now occupy, from the legislature in Gauteng to positions in government to all kinds of things. So there's kind of a relationship between, I think, in the old language, being on the barricade, and the afterlives of inhabiting a visceral expression of rage and translating that into this is not the patronizing idea of growing up, but about recognizing that there is a continuous learning of different moments of radicality that one can inhabit differently to make a different contribution. But the key thing is to see the relationality, as Mark theorizes in his book. Yeah,
thank you for that. Linking to that question, Mark, is a question from Mapula Changela, asking about, so we've been speaking about what are new kinds of institutional formats that we need, and I think the huge challenge here that Mapula asks is, can we pick the conversation on needed forms of state that provide directionality? How would you respond?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a key issue that I explore, but also recognizing the comments about, systemic corruption and hollowing out. So noting, noting that these powerful criminal gangs are there who are looting resources, but conceptually, conceptually what I wanted to confront was this tension between complexity and directionality. So with the shift, the shift from government as structure to governance as a relation, starting in the 1970s and reinforced by the rise of neoliberalism, which decentered polities and weakened the state. One of the consequences of that, especially the fact that this was correlated with the rise of information technology, which is really the rise of the algorithm, a new form of mathematics. Maths becomes a relation, a new form of mathematics which we insert into the complex nodes of our society to manage complexity. In the context of the rise of actual complexity ontologically and the rise of complexity thinking, i.e. epistemologically, we now confront the greatest threat to human civilization climate change and the sustainability challenges. And we need, therefore, to bring the state back in. And we've seen that so clearly in 2020 in the response to COVID-19 crisis, that after decades of demonizing the state as the problem, we all in the end had no choice but to accept that the state plays an absolutely critical role in ensuring that we survive this pandemic. So the question then becomes, how do you bring the state back in without reducing complexity? And that is a real challenge, conceptually and practically. I think for many who basically justify looting and corruption, their argument is that the system doesn't work, so you have to bypass the rules. So that's not the way to go. So the concept that I explore, which is very, very similar to Johan's work on third phase policy making, is the notion of collaboration. So collaboration brings together the notion of calibrate, which is a strategic calculation, and collaboration. And it's used by Bob Jessup to refer to the rise of a new form of relational governance, or the governance of governance. And a very good example in the South African context for me is the Economic Development Partnership in Cape Town, based in Cape Town, directed by Andrew Boraine. A group of 20-25 people who, it's basically a public sector institution that facilitates partnering between public sector institutions to find directionality in a relational way, rather than reasserting or returning back to a Weberian golden age where we trust bureaucracy, especially in the African context. We're never going to get to the point of trusting bureaucracy. It's never going to happen here. But we need directionality, and we can't suppress complexity. So this is the challenge, I think, that we face when we think of the future of the world and the role of states.
Yeah.
I want to say something about directionality. For me, directionality does not mean that the state directs everything. That's a wrong understanding of directionality. Yeah. For me, directionality is that we understand that change has a direction. So there's a political struggle about its direction. So socio-technical system change in the field of transitions or technologies are not neutral. They are political and mobilizing devices. So we need a change process in which is it recognized that the impacts, inequality impacts, climate change impact, are embedded in the choices we make. And at the moment, if you look at science and technology, we push for a lot of innovation, every society, as if all innovation is positive. So we are innovating is positive. Well, a lot of innovations are not positive. So, and we don't discuss the consequences of these technologies when we develop them. So the ICT technologies that are discussed, we have these American companies who develop them without caring about a lot of the privacy issues that we need to care about and who owns the data. So I think for me, directionality is about opening up the space to talk about directionality. And secondly, I do think that we need to engage with this through a radical experimental approach, because we don't know the direction ourselves as well. So participants should be able, people should be able to be involved and have their voice, because what we are talking about in terms of the change needed for climate change, biodiversity and inequality is a real lifestyle change, a big change. It will affect everyone. So people should have a voice. And so we can only discuss directionality in the context of an inclusive process.
Thank you for that, Johan. I wanted to ask you about that because I know that that word directionality is important also in the kind of 8 propositions that you have in your deep transition work. And it's great to see the connections and the interpretation that you give to that. I know that some of our panelists might have some time constraints, and I'd like to ask Edgar whether he'd like to maybe do a last provocation or incantation of the Imbongi before you have to go. You have to leave us a bit earlier, and thank you for your time so far.
No, I've nothing to add at this point, just to again congratulate Mark on an incredible achievement, no least because I have some insight as to just what it takes to do the non-writing, the non-academic work that he does, and I have absolutely no idea where he finds the time to have the mental stillness to produce such an accomplished body of work. So hat off, tip of the hat, Mark, amazing, well done, congratulations. And yeah, I'm looking forward to how we redesign our course for next year, because there's lots of themes that came up in the book, which I thought, oh, we should maybe rethink our course as we tend to do every year. But yeah, so thanks again for allowing me to be part of the conversation. And Johan, it was fantastic to hear you and to meet you. I really appreciated that. And thanks, Rivka, for the able facilitation of the conversation. I'll stay on the call for a few more minutes, but unfortunately I've got some childcare duties to attend to. Thanks.
Thank you, Edgar.
So just to say, I think we'll probably go on for a few more minutes. I think the questions that are sort of coming up, it seems that there's some kind of the difficulty of or the challenge that we have in front of us is this this understanding of the state and how we rethink even the role of the state, and we've spent some time speaking about that, and I think most of the questions that are coming up seems to to question this idea that we could even give the state more power, seeing what has been done in the name of the state. If you look at the role of China in Africa at the moment, or if you look at colonial states in Africa, but I think the kind of the work that you've done, or the sort of explanation on directionality, clarifies that and opens up some kind of a critical engagement or new collaboration, like you said, in that. And I think that is quite something to sit with. It's not something easy for anyone, I think, to swallow, whether you're from the north or from the south. I think that's really kind of a radical engagement. I don't know, Mark or Johan, if you have any other comments or notes on that.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously in the world that we live in, and especially in the South African context, there's a higher levels of disillusionment with the state, and this is and quite often we don't conceptually make a distinction between the state as an institution and politics and the polity. It's clear that the successful examples of more responsive and more qualitative changes are in environments where a new political leadership has emerged. And in particular, the rise of women leadership. And I think that in the South African context, it's very difficult to imagine a new political leadership emerging without a new political party. So how a new political party emerges in the South African context with the kind of political leadership that understands the shifts that have taken place epistemologically, ontologically, sustainability-wise, energy systems, but in particular, the new ways of understanding institutions, in particular, an appreciation for what it takes to build institutions. I think on the whole, South Africans are heavy-handed, are deeply disrespectful of the fact that institutions are fragile. They take years to build, and they can be destroyed in minutes. And the kind of political leadership one needs is the kind of political leadership that really treasures, above all else, the significance of institutions that work. And what does that mean to build those kinds of institutions? So I think if you had that kind of political leadership and you had that kind of appreciation and that kind of culture, because of the way people have been educated for leadership, that might change people's conception of the state and the role of the state. Because we don't have that kind of leadership, we just write off the state completely. And that is going to make it very difficult to really transform society. At the same time, we should never, especially with the rise of information and communication technology, we should recognize that we now have a set of tools that puts in place the capacity for building a whole range of new kinds of institutions that are generally referred to as the commons, that can provide very significant alternatives on scale for the first time. If you have a state that understands that, or a political leadership that understands that there's a way of using state institutions to enable and support that, then you would have the conditions for significant transformation. So it's lots of ifs and buts and possibilities if subject to certain conditions. But just to slide into high levels of disillusionment because of what we've seen is, I think, a bit tragic. But I mean, most of the younger staff that I work with and most of the students are totally disillusioned with old timers like me who still believe in the possibility of a democratic state. I know that.
Yeah, Johan.
Okay, so the current state, from my perspective, was built because we have to undo some of the consequences of the capitalism and the market. Because industrialism and the Industrial Revolution and imperialism led to such heavy consequences that it was clear we needed a countervailing power. And this was called by Polanski embedding, re-embedding the state, the market, sorry. And the state was the countervailing power. I think that state is lost. Why is it lost? Because it's captured by the market. Or by a range of forces that want to continue to use it to exploit the situation and generate all the impacts we talk about. So I think we need a state, what I find attractive in the argument in the book by Mark, we need a state to embed the commons. So we really need to think more about the relationship between the commons and the state. And we need to think about new ways about the state, and also how the state can support experimentation. So I don't think it's about the reform of the existing state. It's about building up a new type of state or state-like functions. And we need to look at the international, the national, and the local level.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Johan. And I think whilst you're online and whilst we have you here, I'd like to maybe also just ask you to comment something about these new kinds of formats or initiatives. I see you have a new post today on citizen collectives with Tina de Moor. Would you maybe just give us a short connection to what you mean with citizen collectives and how that can be embedded in these new forms of state collaboration?
Okay, so she studied, Tina de Moor, the history of the commons, history of collective action, and she included cooperatives, for example, and different forms, guilds, different forms of sharing. And historically, they were developed in response also to industrialization in the 19th century. And then they were either taken over by the state, so the state started to do the work of the commons, and or they became kind of too big to handle for the people themselves. So they became incorporated in a capitalist system. So this led to the kind of understanding that these commons, as I said, are an add-on, a temporary stopgate or a temporary solution, but in the end, the solutions need to come from the state. So I think we need to think about a new governance model, because now we see again these commons emerging. It's really amazing, how many local initiatives we have. And the question is, how can we think about them as alternatives without, them giving up on them because the state takes over, or the state absorbs them, or big firms absorb them, working together with the state. So I don't have solutions here, but I only want to say that Tine de Moor has some kind of interesting ideas here that, well, people could look at.
Thank you. Mark, I was just...
Yeah. Yeah, what really amazes me, Tine de Moor is a very good example of a well-established academic who has really dug deep and documented and written about the history of the commons in a European context. There isn't an equivalent in the African context. So we wax lyrical about the relational character of African society, of Ubuntu, of Ukama, of the power of community, of the significance of the relational dynamics within the informal urban. All of that is there, well documented by anthropologists, sociologists, institutionalists, political scientists. It's all there. But there's something distinctive about the language of the commons, and in particular the implication of institutionalizing the commons in ways that enables the construction of shared knowledge. Shared knowledge on a kind of voluntary construction of shared knowledge in a semi-public domain that the contributors to that knowledge have access to, in a way that then enriches what they then do, and they couldn't construct that kind of knowledge on their own. So they are all over Africa now, the makerspaces. The makerspaces is a very fast spreading movement across the African continent. Actually, if you look at some of the case studies of the way in which some of those have been institutionalized at the local level by, like a university lecturer who's an industrial engineer who sets up a workshop where a whole bunch of machinery is available to people basically walking off the street who want to learn a bunch of skills. And they're now getting contracts. They're regional equipment manufacturers now for certain value chains. So there are examples, but I don't know of work that has analyzed the institutional and governance dynamics of those forms that are emerging. And they are really so fascinating. Edgar's work is moving in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge of the informal commons, or the nature of the commons that seems maybe a bit more institutionalized and formalized in the North, and in Africa it's more, to use Florent de Graaf's words, bottom up, but it's also more informal and not documented in that way. Even voluntary work in Europe is often, I think, institutionalized or documented or assessed for.
Yeah.
Good. I think we're heading towards our end, and I'll have maybe one last question, which is a kind of an economic question. We've dealt a lot with sort of institutionalized governance questions, and maybe just ask Mark and Johan to comment on Odie Stradum's question, which is about economic policy, which tries to force final outcomes by skipping incremental steps. How will one advocate for an incrementalism approach given that the direct outcomes of incremental steps may not be very clear? Or is this the area of more empirical work? So how would that, what is your experience of the economic system and policy making?
Well, there's a section in chapter 2 where I essentially argue that the neoclassical economic paradigm is premised on a fundamental misconception of reality. The general equilibrium models, which have emerged with computerization over the last 20, 30 years, extremely elegant, highly sophisticated, and very, very, very influential in the way in which we formulate economic policy, essentially rest on the first law of thermodynamics, which is that all energy is equal, but it completely ignores the fundamental premise of physics now, which is, it's not just the first law that matters, but the second law. And the second law is about the decline of exergy and the rise of entropy. And overall, yes, energy doesn't decline, but you do have declining useful energy and rising entropy in systems. And this is not modeled in our general equilibrium models. And that is partly why we can't come to terms with entropic systems like climate change. And so what we need is a new generation of economic models. What my colleague and close friend Gaël Giraud, former chief economist of the French Development Bank, calls non-equilibrium general economic models, which are integrative of energy and climate change rather than excluding. And in that way, we will be able to more accurately model the complexity of the real economy, and in that way start formulating economic policies that are more appropriate for our context. So that's essentially the argument, and I conclude that what Brian Arthur is a key exponent of this view, but what Gaël Giraud is doing is now, as the director of the New Center for New Center for Environmental Justice at Georgetown University, where I'm also going to have an affiliation, is setting up a lab for building these actually existing non-equilibrium economic models. And then hopefully we'll be able to kind of take out of the beating heart of national economies, the existing general equilibrium models, and replace them with an alternative pacemaker, which is more appropriate to the way in which real economies work. And that, without replacing general equilibrium models, I'm afraid, our policymakers exist in are in a cockpit looking through in a completely opaque windscreen with no radar system.
That's radical. Johan, you also have to be on your way. Thank you very much for your time thus far and for your input and for being with us.
It was a pleasure.
Do you have any last
Thanks for
comments?
Can I say goodbye or? Okay, so thanks for sharing, and I would like to thank again Mark for his book and for the invitation. I'm sure we will continue the conversation, but hopefully also the practice, in a sense that I do think that we talked about economics. Well, I'm not so optimistic about reform of economics, because we have a lot of heterodox economists that try to reform economics. I think they should talk with other social sciences instead of trying to reform old-fashioned economics. But in any case, let me also say that academia really needs to change the way we work. You know, so what is valued in academia, what is not valued in academia. well, I hope we can continue to work together.
Thank you for your
So,
professionalism.
and thanks to participants. Thanks to participants for their questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Great. So I think we're coming to the close. You see that we've posted some information on the next webinar that will happen on the 26th of November, where there'll be a discussion of chapter 9 of this book. And Mark, maybe you just want to make some information available for that, or do you just want to sort of say who will you be speaking with, or will you be doing that by yourself?
Yeah, so on, it'll just be myself kind of presenting on chapter 9, and Matsilo Matse will facilitate that conversation, the author of the Makanga report that I referred to earlier. Yeah. And yeah, so that will happen on the 26th at 4 p.m. And that'll be the first of a series of 10 webinars that with each webinar will address one of the chapters.
Great, thank you. And information on those webinars will be available on the CST website, I'm sure, and they'll be posted in advance. So thank you very much, Mark, for, first of all, the hard work you did in writing this book and getting it out, but also for giving us the opportunity to engage more closely and deeper with your ideas. And also it was wonderful to have Edgar and Johan that have been your thinking and wrestling partners, see how they engage with you, and to sort of just see, you know, how these ideas also resonate within the broader community. Thank you to all the participants for your time. I know 2 hours is a long time for a meeting, and thank you for staying engaged, your critical questions, yeah, and for being with us. And I hope that we can continue this journey together to explore the ideas that Mark's brought out in this book. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.